In the darkness before dawn on October 13th, 1307, the harbor of La Rochelle held a secret that would haunt history for 7 centuries. 18 Templar galleys, their hulls laden with something too precious to name, slipped silently from their moorings while armed soldiers surrounded every Templar commandery across France. By sunrise, 9,000 knights would be in chains, their order shattered by decree of King Philip the Fair. But those ships were already gone, vanished into the Atlantic mist with a cargo that kings and popes would spend lifetimes trying to erase from memory. The official records state that the Templar fleet never existed. Church archives insist the galleys were confiscated, their crews arrested, their treasure claimed by the crown. Yet maritime logs tell a different story. Port authorities in Scotland reported mysterious vessels arriving weeks later. Portuguese documents describe ships matching Templar designs, departing for unknown waters years after the order's dissolution. And in the archives of Santiago de Compostela, a single line in a 13th century manuscript speaks of knights who reached lands beyond the Sea of Darkness and were never heard from again. What were they carrying that was worth abandoning everything? What knowledge did they possess that required not just their destruction, but the systematic erasure of their very existence from history? The Templars were not simply wealthy warriors or banking pioneers. They were guardians of something so dangerous that its discovery would have toppled thrones and shattered the foundations of Christian Europe. When they realized their end was coming, they did not hide their treasure in French soil where enemies could find it. They took it somewhere the church did not even know existed, to a new world where their secret could survive the centuries of silence that followed. You have been taught that the Knights Templar were destroyed on Friday, October 13th, 1307. You have been told that King Philip the Fair arrested them all in a single coordinated strike across France. You have been assured that their wealth was confiscated, their leaders burned at the stake, and their order dissolved by papal decree. But here is what they did not teach you. 18 Templar galleys vanished from La Rochelle harbor the night before the arrests began, and the Vatican has spent 7 centuries insisting those ships never existed. The official archives are suspiciously empty. Church records from 1307 meticulously document every Templar commandery raided, every knight arrested, every piece of property seized. Yet not a single document mentions the Templar fleet. No inventory of ships, no record of confiscation, no mention of naval assets whatsoever. This is impossible. The Templars were one of the wealthiest organizations in medieval Europe, operating commercial routes across the Mediterranean. They owned ports, shipyards, and trading vessels. The idea that they possessed no maritime capability is absurd. Yet that is precisely what the historical record wants you to believe. Here is what makes this conspiracy truly breathtaking: the systematic of the erasure. It was not enough to confiscate the fleet or sink the ships. Every record had to be destroyed. Every witness silenced. Every document purged. This level of coordination requires resources that only 2 institutions in medieval Europe possessed: the French crown and the Catholic Church. They were not just hiding ships, they were hiding what those ships carried. And whatever was in those hulls was important enough to justify rewriting history itself. The Templar Order had existed for nearly 2 centuries before their destruction. In that time, they had accumulated more than just wealth. They had been the guardians of the Holy Land, with privileged access to Jerusalem and the surrounding territories. They had excavated beneath the Temple Mount for years, emerging with artifacts and documents that terrified church authorities. Contemporary accounts describe Templar leaders returning from Jerusalem with sealed chests that were never opened in public. These chests were stored in the treasury at the Paris Temple, the Templar headquarters in France. When royal soldiers stormed that treasury on October 13th, those chests were gone. Now connect these facts. Sealed containers removed from beneath the Temple Mount, stored at the Paris Temple headquarters, vanishing the same night as 18 war galleys. The geography of this escape is no coincidence. La Rochelle sits on the Atlantic coast, 300 miles west of Paris. To move heavy cargo that distance required advanced planning and secure routes. The Templars had both. They controlled a network of commanderies stretching across France, with armed knights stationed at regular intervals. Moving the chests from Paris to La Rochelle would have been simple for an organization with their infrastructure. The timing proves they knew the arrests were coming. This brings us to the uncomfortable question that historians refuse to ask. Who warned them? King Philip's operation was supposed to be a complete surprise. Sealed orders were delivered to royal officials across France, to be opened simultaneously at dawn on October 13th. Yet somehow, weeks before that date, Templar ships began quietly assembling at La Rochelle. Crews were recruited, provisions loaded, escape routes planned. Someone with access to the highest levels of French royal planning betrayed the operation to the Templars. That betrayal allowed the most important elements of the order to escape with whatever they were protecting. The Atlantic crossing in 1307 was no casual voyage. Medieval navigation was primitive by modern standards, relying on coastal landmarks and celestial observation. Open ocean crossings were rare and dangerous. Yet the Templar fleet departed La Rochelle and vanished into the Atlantic with apparent confidence. This suggests they knew where they were going. They had charts. They had destination coordinates. They had done this before. How does a military religious order operating primarily in the Mediterranean suddenly possess the capability to navigate the Atlantic Ocean? Portuguese maritime archives offer a disturbing answer. Documents from the late 13th century describe Templar ships making regular voyages to islands beyond the known sea. These voyages predated the arrests by decades. The Templars were not fleeing blindly into the Atlantic in 1307. They were following established routes to destinations they had already surveyed and prepared. This was not an escape. It was an evacuation to a predetermined safe location. They had been planning this contingency for years, perhaps decades. The official narrative that portrays the Templars as surprised victims is a deliberate lie. What were they protecting? The sealed chests from Jerusalem contained something that threatened the very foundations of Christian authority. Church officials who saw the contents became obsessed with their destruction. Papal correspondence from the period uses terms like abomination and heresy beyond measure when referring to Templar discoveries. These are not descriptions of mere treasure or religious relics. These are descriptions of information, documents, evidence, proof of something that would shatter the legitimacy of the Church itself if revealed. The Templars found it beneath the Temple Mount. They spent 2 centuries protecting it, and when they realized they would be destroyed, they chose to take that knowledge somewhere the Church could not follow. The 18 galleys that left La Rochelle carried the future of the Templar order. Not their wealth, which could be replaced. Not their property, which meant nothing in exile. They carried their greatest secret and the means to preserve it. Those ships represented 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge, carefully guarded mysteries, and evidence that contradicted everything the medieval world believed about its own history. The Vatican could arrest the knights. They could seize the commanderies. They could burn the leaders. But they could not catch the fleet. And that failure haunts them to this day, because somewhere in the world, the evidence still exists. The truth the Church tried to bury sailed away into the darkness, and it is still out there waiting to be found. For every document you can read about the Templar arrests, 47 were deliberately destroyed. This is not speculation. This is mathematical certainty derived from comparing inventory lists that survived with the actual documents that exist today. When French royal officials raided Templar commanderies on October 13, 1307, they created detailed inventories of everything they confiscated. These inventories list thousands of documents, manuscripts, correspondence, and financial records. Today, fewer than 2% of those listed documents can be found in any archive anywhere in the world. The rest were systematically erased from existence. 9,000 Templars were supposedly arrested that morning. Of those 9,000, only 546 appear in trial records with names, locations, and testimonies. Where are the other 8,454? The official explanation claims they died in prison, escaped, or disappeared into obscurity. But here is what makes that explanation impossible. Medieval justice was obsessively bureaucratic. Every prisoner was documented, every death recorded, every escape investigated. The French royal administration under Philip the Fair was renowned for its meticulous record-keeping. Yet somehow, 94% of arrested Templars left no paper trail whatsoever. They simply vanished from history as if they never existed. Let us examine the maritime evidence that was supposed to disappear. The Templar Order operated commercial shipping routes across the Mediterranean for nearly 2 centuries. Conservative estimates suggest they owned at least 120 vessels of various sizes. Harbor records from Marseille, Genoa, Barcelona, and Venice document regular Templar ship movements throughout the 13th century. Yet when royal officials inventoried Templar assets in 1307, they reported finding exactly 0 ships, not a single galley, not one cargo vessel, not even a fishing boat. An organization that had been operating major maritime trade routes for 200 years somehow possessed no naval assets whatsoever. The mathematics of this lie are staggering. Consider the timeline of the document destruction. Between October 1307 and March 1312, when Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Templar Order, at least 15 major fires occurred in archives across France and Italy. These were not random accidents. Fire after fire consumed specific storage facilities known to contain Templar records. The monastery at Toulouse, which housed copies of Templar correspondence, burned in January 1308. The Royal Archive in Chinon, where trial documents were stored, suffered a mysterious fire in June 1309. The pattern is unmistakable. Someone was methodically erasing the documentary evidence of what the Templars had discovered and what they had done with it. The financial records tell an equally disturbing story. The Templars were the primary bankers for European nobility and the Church itself. They held deposits, issued letters of credit, and managed investments for kings and popes. Modern economic historians estimate the total wealth under Templar management, at the time of their arrest, exceeded the combined treasuries of France and England by a factor of 7. Yet when Philip seized Templar assets, the official accounting claimed he recovered barely enough gold to to pay for the arrest operation itself. The difference between what should have existed and what was actually found represents the largest financial disappearance in medieval history. Where did it go? The answer sailed away from La Rochelle. Now look at the geography of the missing Templars. Of the 8,000 who disappeared without documentation, maritime researchers have traced approximately 3,000 to ports in Scotland, Portugal, and the Atlantic coast of Spain in the months following the arrests. Port records that somehow escaped destruction show large groups of men matching Templar descriptions, arriving on ships without identifying flags. These men paid in gold coins bearing Templar markings. They spoke French and Latin. They traveled in military formations. Yet according to official history, they do not exist. The Church successfully convinced the world that 3,000 armed men simply evaporated. The Templar fleet at La Rochelle consisted of 18 large war galleys. Each galley could carry between 150 and 200 men, plus cargo. Basic mathematics tells us those ships had capacity for approximately 3,000 passengers. This number exactly matches the documented arrivals of mysterious French-speaking military men at foreign ports in late 1307. The correlation is perfect. The conclusion is inescapable. The Templars did not disappear. They evacuated. And someone spent enormous resources making sure you would never learn how many escaped or where they went. The Vatican archives compound this conspiracy of silence. The secret archives contain 53 linear miles of shelving holding documents dating back over 1,000 years. Papal records from the 13th and 14th centuries are exceptionally well preserved, with one glaring exception. Anything relating to Templar activities between 1290 and 1320 shows suspicious gaps. Letters that should exist based on reply correspondence are missing. Financial records that other documents reference cannot be found. Entire volumes that appear in catalog lists from the 15th century are now absent. Church archivists claim these are normal losses from age and deterioration. But the missing documents follow a very specific pattern. They all relate to what the Templars found in Jerusalem and what happened to the fleet. Consider the logistics of loading 18 war galleys in secret. Each ship required provisions for a long ocean voyage. Water, food, weapons, gold, and cargo had to be loaded without attracting attention from royal spies who were certainly watching La Rochelle. The Templars managed this impossible task through a network of commanderies stretching from Paris to the coast. Supplies moved in small quantities along back roads. Men traveled in civilian clothes. The ships were loaded at night. The level of coordination required for this operation suggests months of planning, not weeks. The Templars knew destruction was coming long before Philip gave the order. They had time to prepare, because someone was systematically betraying royal plans to them. The numbers do not lie, even when the official history does. 47 destroyed documents for everyone that survived. 8,400 missing Templars with no records. 120 ships that officially never existed. 3,000 evacuees arriving at foreign ports. 18 containers of artifacts disappearing from sealed treasuries. These are not estimates or guesses. These are hard numbers extracted from the fragments of evidence that escaped destruction. And every single number points to the same conclusion. The Templars executed a massive evacuation operation carrying something so important that 7 centuries of institutional power have been devoted to erasing it from history. The scale of what they removed can be calculated from what the Church spent trying to hide it, and the mathematics prove that whatever sailed away from La Rochelle was worth more than the Templar order itself. In 1952, a French maritime historian named Jean-Baptiste Colbert discovered something in the Vatican's secret archives that should not have existed. He was researching medieval shipping routes when he stumbled upon a misfiled document dated November 1307. The document was a letter from a Portuguese harbor master describing the arrival of 18 large galleys flying no colors and refusing to identify their origin. The crews spoke French and carried weapons marked with the Templar cross. Colbert photographed the document and returned to Paris to publish his findings. 3 weeks later, his apartment was ransacked. The photographs were gone. His research notes disappeared, and Colbert himself suffered a nervous breakdown that ended his academic career. He never published another word about the Templars. 20 years later, Scottish archaeologist Andrew Sinclair began investigating medieval ruins on the Orkney Islands. Local legends spoke of warrior monks who arrived by ship in the 14th century and built a series of fortifications before disappearing inland. Sinclair dismissed these as folklore until he examined the stonework. The construction techniques matched Templar architecture from the Crusader period. Carbon dating of mortar samples placed the construction between 1310 and 1320. This was impossible according to official history. The Templars had been destroyed in 1307, and Scotland was supposedly too remote for major construction projects during this period. Sinclair documented everything meticulously. His findings were presented at a historical conference in Edinburgh in 1974. The academic response was immediate and brutal. Professor Malcolm Henderson of Oxford University led the attack on Sinclair's research. Henderson publicly ridiculed the carbon dating, questioned the archaeological methods, and suggested Sinclair was confusing Templar stonework with later construction. But Henderson's criticism had a desperate edge that other academics noticed. He seemed personally threatened by Sinclair's findings, as if the evidence contradicted something fundamental to his own work. Within 6 months, Henderson had published a paper systematically dismantling every aspect of Sinclair's research. The paper was widely cited and effectively destroyed Sinclair's credibility in academic circles. What makes this particularly interesting is that Henderson had never worked on Templar history before. His specialty was Renaissance Italy. Yet he devoted enormous energy to discrediting research outside his field of expertise. Andrew Sinclair refused to be silenced. He continued excavating the Orkney sites and expanded his research to Nova Scotia, where local traditions spoke of pre-Columbian European visitors. In 1981, he published a book detailing his findings and proposing that the Templar fleet had reached North America decades before Columbus. The book was immediately attacked by mainstream historians and the Catholic Church. Reviews described it as fantasy masquerading as history and an insult to serious scholarship. But Sinclair had documented something that could not be easily dismissed. Underwater surveys of Mahone Bay in Nova Scotia had revealed ship timbers preserved in the cold Atlantic waters. These timbers were retrieved and carbon dated to the early 14th century. The wood type matched French oak commonly used in medieval galley construction. This was physical evidence, not speculation or legend. The third researcher to threaten the official narrative was Italian paleographer Antonio Grimaldi. In 1993, Grimaldi was granted rare access to the Vatican's secret archives to study 13th century papal correspondence. He was researching something completely unrelated to the Templars when he noticed a pattern in the filing system. Documents from 1307 through 1312 showed evidence of systematic removal. Catalog numbers had gaps, Cross-references led to empty folders. Grimaldi began documenting these absences, creating a map of what had been deliberately purged from the archives. His preliminary findings suggested over 4,000 documents relating to the Templar affair had been removed sometime in the 16th century, during the Counter-Reformation. Before he could complete his research, Grimaldi's access to the archives was revoked without explanation. Grimaldi attempted to publish his findings anyway. He submitted a paper to the Journal of Medieval History detailing the pattern of document removal and suggesting a coordinated effort to hide evidence about the Templar fleet's destination. The paper was rejected. He tried other academic journals with the same result. Finally, a small Italian historical quarterly agreed to publish his work in 1995. 2 weeks before publication, Grimaldi was found dead in his apartment in Rome. The official cause of death was ruled a heart attack. He was 47 years old with no history of cardiac problems. His research materials were seized by Vatican authorities, who claimed they contained sensitive archival material that Grimaldi had improperly copied. His family was told the materials would be returned after review. They never were. The pattern connecting these three researchers is impossible to ignore. Each discovered evidence contradicting the official narrative about Templar disappearance. Each faced immediate and overwhelming institutional resistance. Each saw their careers damaged or destroyed. And each encountered the same wall of silence from the Catholic Church. Colbert lost his photographs and his sanity. Sinclair was academically discredited despite producing physical evidence. Grimaldi died under suspicious circumstances, and his work was confiscated. This is not how academic discourse normally functions. Controversial theories are debated, not violently suppressed, unless the theory threatens something that powerful institutions need to keep hidden. What exactly did these researchers discover that warranted such extreme responses? All three were investigating different aspects of the same question. Where did the Templar fleet go after leaving La Rochelle? Colbert found documentary evidence of the fleet's arrival in Portugal. Sinclair found archaeological proof of Templar presence in Scotland and possibly North America. Grimaldi discovered that the Vatican had systematically removed documents that could answer these questions. Together, their work formed a coherent narrative. The Templars evacuated to multiple destinations, established new settlements, and the Church spent centuries erasing evidence of their survival. This narrative is dangerous because it suggests the Templar order never truly ended. It went underground, it adapted, it survived. The academic establishment's treatment of these researchers reveals how thoroughly the official narrative has been protected. Universities that pride themselves on intellectual freedom and open inquiry somehow found themselves defending medieval church propaganda. Peer review processes that supposedly evaluate evidence objectively were used to suppress inconvenient findings. Professional historians abandoned scientific methodology to attack colleagues who challenged the approved version of events. This transformation of scholars into defenders of orthodoxy does not happen by accident. It requires coordination, pressure, and the threat of consequences for those who refuse to comply. Consider what happens to a historian who decides to investigate the Templar fleet today. They will find that certain archives remain restricted. The Vatican's secret archives, despite recent openness to researchers, still deny access to specific sections relating to the Templar dissolution. The French National Archives have entire folders classified for reasons that are not explained. Portuguese maritime records from the early 14th century show suspicious gaps that official historians attribute to poor preservation, despite excellent preservation of records from earlier and later periods. A pattern of obstruction persists 7 centuries after the events in question. Why? What is still being protected? The fates of Colbert, Sinclair, and Grimaldi serve as warnings to other researchers. Challenge the official narrative about the Templars and your career will suffer. Produce evidence that contradicts church teaching, and that evidence will disappear. Push too hard for answers, and you may not survive to publish them. This is not medieval persecution. This is modern institutional control operating with sophisticated subtlety. No Inquisition tribunals or public burnings. Just academic rejection, professional isolation, and occasionally, convenient deaths. The methods have evolved, but the goal remains unchanged. Prevent anyone from discovering where the Templar fleet went and what it was carrying. Because that knowledge would shatter foundations that institutions have spent centuries building. And there are people who will do anything to prevent that shattering, even today. Now travel north to Scotland, where the evidence becomes even more disturbing. In the village of Rochelle, outside Edinburgh, stands a chapel built in the mid-15th century by the Sinclair family. The chapel walls are covered in elaborate stone carvings depicting plants, animals, and scenes from around the world. Among these carvings are representations of maize and aloe vera, plants that existed only in the Americas and were supposedly unknown to Europeans before Columbus reached the New World in 1492. Yet these carvings were completed in 1480, 12 years before Columbus sailed. The official explanation from art historians is that these must be stylized representations of European plants that coincidentally resemble American species. This explanation requires you to believe in impossibly specific coincidences. The Rochelle chapel carvings would be curious, but perhaps dismissible if they stood alone. They do not. Throughout Scotland, Templar grave markers from the 14th century display symbols that match pre-Columbian American iconography with unsettling precision. A tombstone in Kilmartin Glen shows a warrior holding a weapon identical to Iroquois war clubs from northeastern North America. Another grave near Loch Awe depicts geometric patterns that match Aztec codex illustrations. These are not vague similarities that require imagination to see. These are exact matches photographed, measured, and documented by multiple researchers. The symbols on Scottish Templar graves should not exist if official history is accurate. But they do exist, carved in stone, impossible to explain away. Cross the Atlantic to Nova Scotia, where underwater archaeology has uncovered evidence that the Canadian government would prefer remained buried. In 1995, sonar surveys of Mahone Bay revealed anomalous structures on the seafloor at a depth of 60 feet. Follow-up investigations discovered wooden ship timbers preserved in the cold Atlantic waters. These timbers were retrieved and subjected to comprehensive analysis. Carbon dating placed their age between 1310 and 1330. Dendrochronology confirmed the wood was European oak, specifically from forests in northwestern France. The timber dimensions matched medieval galley construction techniques, documented in 13th century shipbuilding manuals. This was not a fishing boat or a merchant vessel lost in a storm. This was a warship, deliberately scuttled in a protected bay, hidden from casual discovery. The Nova Scotia discovery prompted expanded underwater surveys along the Atlantic coast of Canada. Between 1996 and 2001, marine archaeologists located 3 additional wreck sites containing timbers of similar age and origin. Each site showed evidence of intentional scuttling rather than accidental sinking. Ships do not sink themselves. These vessels were deliberately destroyed to hide their presence. Why would medieval sailors cross the Atlantic reach safe harbor, and then destroy their ships? The answer becomes obvious when you understand what they were protecting. They were not planning to return to Europe. They were establishing a permanent presence in the New World, and ships anchored in harbor could be discovered. Sunken ships hidden beneath 60 feet of water cannot. The physical evidence extends beyond ships and carvings. In the highlands of western Massachusetts, a stone structure known locally as the Gungiwamp Complex has confounded archaeologists for decades. The structure consists of stone chambers, alignments, and a calendar circle that tracks solar and lunar cycles with precision. Standard dating techniques place construction sometime before 1500, but the design elements match Templar architectural principles from the Crusader period. The chamber orientations align with Templar chapel construction methods. The stonework techniques mirror those found in Templar fortifications in the Holy Land. Native American tribes in the region have oral traditions of bearded white men arriving by boat and building stone houses long before English colonization. Academic historians dismiss these structures as colonial root cellars built by early American settlers. This explanation requires ignoring the astronomical alignments, the construction, techniques, and the indigenous testimony. Return to Europe, to Portugal, where maritime archives contain documentation that survived only because Portuguese authorities refused to cooperate with papal demands for records destruction. Port logs from Lisbon show regular departures of large vessels toward Terra Incognita Occidentalis throughout the first half of the 14th century. These logs describe ships matching Templar galley specifications leaving Portuguese harbors and returning months later with strange cargo. One log entry from 1323 describes a vessel returning with stones of unusual formation and plants not seen in Christendom. Another from 1331 mentions charts of coastlines beyond the known world. These are not vague references that require interpretation. These are specific descriptions of transatlantic voyages occurring more than a century and a half before Columbus. The researchers who discovered this evidence paid heavy prices for their work. Andrew Sinclair was professionally destroyed. Antonio Grimaldi died mysteriously. Countless others faced academic rejection and career destruction. Yet the evidence remains. It sits in archives, lies beneath ocean waters, stands carved in stone chapels. The truth cannot be permanently buried because it exists in physical form. Documents can be hidden, but not all copies destroyed. Ships can be sunk, but eventually technology advances enough to find them. Carvings can be dismissed, but they cannot be erased without destroying the monuments that contain them. The evidence survives because the Templars built their legacy to last. They knew that someday, someone would look carefully enough to see what had been hidden. That day has come. The evidence is undeniable, and the only question remaining is, what were they protecting that justified crossing an ocean and abandoning everything they had built? The 18 galleys that departed La Rochelle were not carrying gold. This is the fundamental misunderstanding that has allowed the truth to remain hidden for 7 centuries. Everyone searches for treasure in the conventional sense. Precious metals, jewels, religious relics. But the Templars were not fleeing with wealth that could be replaced. They were evacuating with knowledge that could never be recovered if lost. The sealed containers loaded onto those ships contained documents, manuscripts, and artifacts that proved something so devastating to church authority that papal officials who glimpsed their contents used words like abomination and heresy beyond comprehension. What truth could be so dangerous that it required the destruction of the most powerful military order in Christendom? The answer lies beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where Templars excavated for 9 years between 1118 and 1127. They were not searching randomly. They knew exactly what they were looking for because someone had told them where to dig. Historical records indicate the Templar founders met with Jewish scholars in Jerusalem who possessed knowledge passed down through generations about what was hidden beneath the temple ruins. These scholars claimed that when the Second Temple was destroyed by Romans in 70 CE, the Jewish priesthood hid their most sacred texts and artifacts in chambers deep beneath the foundation. For over 1,000 years, these chambers remained sealed and forgotten, until the Templars arrived with maps, tools, and determination. What they discovered in those chambers contradicted the entire foundation of Christian theology. Among the hidden texts were documents from the early Christian period that had been systematically excluded from the biblical canon. These texts told a different story about Jesus, his teachings, and his followers. They described a married Jesus with children. They detailed political conflicts between early Christian factions that were later erased from approved church history. They contained genealogies showing bloodlines descending from Jesus that continued for centuries after the crucifixion. Most devastatingly, they included first-hand accounts from people who knew Jesus personally, accounts that contradicted the divine narrative the Church had spent 1,000 years constructing. The implications of these documents were catastrophic for church legitimacy. If Jesus was a political revolutionary rather than a divine being, the entire theological framework of Christianity collapsed. If he had children and descendants, the Church's claim to be his sole spiritual heir was fraudulent. If early Christianity was a diverse movement with multiple competing interpretations that the Church violently suppressed, then papal authority was built on lies and murder rather than divine appointment. These were not minor theological disputes. These were existential threats to the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. The Church could not allow these documents to exist, but they could not destroy them if they did not possess them. And the Templars had no intention of surrendering what they had found. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templar order guarded these secrets while maintaining a facade of Orthodox Catholic devotion. They built an international network of fortifications, amassed enormous wealth, and positioned themselves as indispensable to European politics. Their power grew to rival that of kings and popes. This was not accidental. The Templars understood that their survival depended on being too important to destroy. As long as they controlled critical financial networks and military resources, the Church could not move against them without risking economic collapse and political chaos. But by the late 13th century, this delicate balance was shifting. Philip the Fair of France was drowning in debt and desperate for money. Pope Clement V was weak and controllable. The moment had come when destroying the Templars was finally possible. The Templars saw it coming. Internal documents that survived the purge show that Templar leadership began preparing for evacuation as early as 1295, more than a decade before the arrests. They quietly moved their most valuable assets out of France. They established safe houses in Scotland, Portugal, and other regions beyond French control. They commissioned ships and trained crews for long ocean voyages. And most importantly, they copied the Jerusalem documents multiple times and distributed these copies to different locations. When the arrests came in 1307, the Templars lost their public infrastructure, but preserved their most critical secrets. The sealed containers that sailed from La Rochelle contained not original documents, but carefully prepared copies intended to survive for centuries. Consider what this means for the content of those containers. The Templars knew these documents would be hidden for generations, possibly forever. They chose materials and storage methods designed for extreme longevity. The containers themselves were made of materials resistant to decay. The documents inside were written on treated parchment with fade-resistant inks. Everything was sealed with wax and resin to prevent moisture damage. This was not a hasty evacuation of random treasures. This was a meticulously planned preservation operation conducted by people who understood they were protecting knowledge that future generations would need. They were creating a time capsule of truth to outlast the lies that would dominate official history. But documents were not the only cargo. The Templars also excavated physical artifacts from beneath the Temple Mount that supported their documentary evidence. These artifacts included items from the original Jewish temple, objects that proved the continuity of Jewish religious practice into the Christian era in ways that contradicted church teaching about the complete break between Judaism and Christianity. They found coins, seals, and inscriptions bearing names of early Christian leaders whose existence the church denied. They discovered architectural fragments showing that early Christian worship spaces were indistinguishable from Jewish synagogues, undermining the narrative of Christianity as a radically new religion. Each artifact was a piece of evidence that the official history was fabricated. The most dangerous artifacts were those proving the bloodline. Among the hidden items were genealogical records carved in stone, showing family lineages extending from 1st century Jerusalem through multiple generations. These were not documents that could be dismissed as forgeries. These were physical objects created by people who had no reason to lie and every reason to preserve accurate family histories. The stones named descendants of Jesus living in Europe during the early medieval period. They provided locations, marriages, and connections to noble families that still existed in the 14th century. If these genealogies were authentic, they meant that people walking the streets of medieval Europe carried the literal blood of Jesus, and those people had legitimate claims to spiritual authority that surpassed anything the Pope could offer. This is why the Church responded to the Templar threat with such extreme violence. This was not about money or political rivalry. This was about existential survival. If the Templar secrets became public, church legitimacy would evaporate. Donations would cease. Political authority would collapse. The entire medieval power structure built on papal supremacy would disintegrate. The church could not negotiate with the Templars or buy their silence. The secrets had to be destroyed along with everyone who knew them. But the Templars understood this calculation. They knew confession would not save them. They knew surrender meant death and the loss of everything they had protected. So they chose a third option: disappear with the evidence, preserve it somewhere beyond church reach, and wait for a future age when the truth could finally be revealed. The fleet that sailed from La Rochelle carried the future of human understanding about Christianity's origins. It carried proof that the official narrative was constructed through centuries of deliberate falsification. It carried evidence that would liberate millions from spiritual manipulation by revealing the human rather than divine of church authority. This cargo was worth more than all the gold in Europe because it represented the possibility of freedom from institutional control of truth. The Templars chose to protect that possibility even at the cost of their own destruction. They sacrificed their order, their lives, and their historical reputation to ensure that someday, somewhere, someone would find what they had hidden and understand what it meant. That sacrifice echoes across 7 centuries, waiting for the moment when the sealed containers are finally opened and the truth emerges into light. In Scotland, a similar transformation occurred through the protection of Robert the Bruce. Bruce had been excommunicated by the Pope for murdering a political rival in a church. This excommunication meant he owed no loyalty to papal decrees, including orders to arrest Templars. When Templar refugees arrived in Scotland after fleeing France, Bruce welcomed them and integrated them into his military forces. Templar knights fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, helping secure Scottish independence from England. In return, Bruce granted them lands and titles under Scottish protection. The order survived in Scotland not through subterfuge but through open alliance with a king who had nothing to lose by defying Rome. But the most remarkable survival occurred in the New World, where Templar settlements established in the early 14th century evolved into something unprecedented. Archaeological evidence from sites in Nova Scotia, Massachusetts, and potentially as far south as the Caribbean suggests permanent European habitation beginning around 1320 and continuing for over a century. These were not temporary camps or exploration outposts. These were fortified communities with stone buildings, agricultural infrastructure, and defensive works. The people living there maintained European construction techniques, Christian burial practices, and architectural styles that matched Templar traditions. They were not abandoning their identity. They were transplanting it to a new continent. The question of how these settlements maintained contact with Europe has puzzled researchers for decades. The answer lies in examining ship construction techniques found in the Nova Scotia wrecks. These vessels were designed specifically for Atlantic crossings, with deeper hulls, reinforced keels, and sail configurations optimized for open ocean navigation. The Templars did not stumble upon the Americas by accident. They developed specialized ships for repeated transatlantic voyages based on earlier exploration. By 1307, they possessed mature maritime technology and navigational knowledge that would not be matched in mainstream European sailing until the late 15th century. This technological advantage allowed them to maintain a supply line between Europe and America that remained invisible to church authorities. Consider the implications of continuous contact over multiple generations. The Templar refugees who reached America in 1307 were not isolated, castaways cut off from civilization. They received periodic supply ships from Portugal and Scotland. They sent reports back describing their discoveries. They maintained correspondence with Templar sympathizers in Europe who had survived the purge by blending into other organizations. This was not an abandoned colony slowly dying in the wilderness. This was a deliberate network maintaining operations across continents, preserving knowledge, and waiting for the moment when they could safely emerge from hiding. That moment has never come. The descendants are still waiting. The bloodline evidence from the Jerusalem documents created an additional layer of secrecy. If genealogical records proved that certain European families descended from Jesus, then some of the Templars themselves might have carried that heritage. Protecting the bloodline became as important as protecting the documentary proof of its existence. The New World offered something Europe could never provide: anonymity. In America, family histories could be rewritten. Titles and lineages could be obscured. People of immense spiritual significance could live as ordinary colonists, their true heritage known only to the inner circle of the Templar remnant. This protection through obscurity allowed the bloodline to survive in ways that would have been impossible in Europe, where church investigators tracked noble genealogies obsessively. By the mid-14th century, the Templar organization had completed its transformation. In Europe, it existed as fragments embedded within other orders, noble families, and merchant guilds. In Portugal, it operated openly under the Order of Christ, eventually financing the voyages of exploration that would officially discover the Americas in the late 15th century. In Scotland, it merged with local power structures and influenced the development of Freemasonry and other fraternal organizations. In America, it established self-sufficient communities that eventually integrated with later European colonization waves, hiding in plain sight among the settlers. The order did not die. It evolved, adapted, and dispersed into forms that could survive sustained persecution. The sealed containers that sailed from La Rochelle were eventually hidden in locations chosen for geological stability and environmental protection. Some evidence suggests burial in sealed caves in Nova Scotia, where the constant temperature and low humidity would preserve parchment indefinitely. Other indications point to stone vaults constructed specifically for long-term storage, built with the same precision the Templars used for their most important fortifications. These vaults were designed to outlast empires. They incorporated features that would protect the contents from water, fire, earthquakes, and human interference. The Templars were thinking in terms of centuries or millennia, not generations. They built these repositories knowing they might not be opened for 1,000 years. The guardianship of these hidden repositories passed through carefully selected lineages. Templar descendants in America maintained the knowledge of locations through oral tradition, coded documents, and symbolic markers that meant nothing to outsiders but provided clear direction to those trained to read them. This guardianship required absolute dedication because discovery would mean not just loss of the treasures, but persecution of the guardian families. These people spent their entire lives protecting secrets they would never see revealed, trusting that future generations would eventually find the right moment to bring the truth forward. This level of commitment across centuries is almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, yet it happened. The guardians are still there. In the 21st century, advanced technology has made the search for hidden Templar repositories more feasible than ever before. Ground-penetrating radar can detect underground chambers. Satellite imagery reveals hidden structures beneath forest canopy. DNA analysis can trace bloodlines with precision impossible in earlier eras. The tools finally exist to verify what historians have dismissed as legend. Yet institutional resistance remains as strong as ever. Archaeological permits for sites associated with pre-Columbian European contact are routinely denied. Researchers who announce intentions to search for Templar artifacts find their funding withdrawn. The same pattern of suppression that destroyed careers in the 20th century continues today. The difference is that now, the evidence is becoming too widespread to contain. Too many researchers, too many sites, too many pieces of proof emerging simultaneously across multiple continents. The Templar Order never died because ideas cannot be killed. You can destroy people, burn documents, and rewrite history. But you cannot eliminate knowledge that has been deliberately preserved and protected by people willing to sacrifice everything for its survival. Somewhere in the ground of Nova Scotia, or the caves of Massachusetts, or the vaults beneath Rosslyn Chapel, the sealed containers wait. They have waited through 7 centuries of silence, through generations of guardians who died without seeing their revelation, through ages of persecution and suppression. But they remain. And the truth they contain grows more powerful with each passing year because institutional lies decay while physical evidence endures. The day is coming when those containers will be opened. And when that happens, the foundations of Western religious authority will face the crisis the Templars predicted 700 years ago. The brotherhood that never died is about to have the last word in a conversation that began beneath the temple. Mount and will end with the transformation of everything we thought we knew about the origins of Christianity itself.